1 year ago today, on October 17th, 2023, Sonic Superstars released. This was a pretty big deal for me at the time, as I loved Generation's classic Sonic stages, so having a whole game supposedly based on them was a dream come true. I remember picking it up on launch day and beating it that night and thinking, wow, this game is really bad. If I'm being honest, I hated Sonic Superstars. It was at one point my least favorite mainline Sonic game, and it took me months to build the courage to go back and get the true ending and even the Platinum Trophy. I just found the game to be more difficult than it needed to be, and I absolutely hated the soundtrack. And I guess I wasn't alone on this, as it's still regarded to be a very mediocre and forgettable Sonic game. But hey, it's been a year since the game came out, so what better time than now to give it a real, fair, and second shot? Will I still consider this game as low as the ones that shall not be named, or will it turn out to be just as great as its classic Genesis brothers? This is Sonic Superstars 1 year later. The story of Sonic Superstars sees the return of Fang and even introduces a new character called Trip. It consists of Eggman wanting to summon some big-ass dragon, and that's all I got from it. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be honest, there's not much to work with here, but there are some pretty cool 2D animated cutscenes, so that's nice. But story isn't important here anyways. What is important is the presentation, which is the big grand change of this game. Sonic Superstars opts to go for a modern 2.5D approach, which I'm honestly a big fan of. The graphics are not the neatest, especially compared to the much greater Generations classic levels that came out 12 years prior. But they still look very good in my opinion, even if a bit pudgy. I can't help but get the feeling that this is what they wanted the Sonic 4 games to look like, but those failed. I mean, I will say, some assets and areas look disgusting and low budget. Like, how does this retail for $60? But for the most part, this is a vibrant, squishy, and just colorful game that sticks out, even if it's kind of held back by inconsistency. But as you know, this wouldn't be a good Sonic game without the fun, fast-paced, rewarding gameplay. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, Sonic Superstars is built to be a great 2D Sonic game. It has all of these, honestly. All the levels in this game are a ton of fun to speed through and have a lot of alternative pathways. Bridge Hill Zone might be one of my favorite opening acts ever. It's funny because, as I mentioned earlier, I never saw this game in this way. I originally hated these levels and found them to be too lengthy and difficult, but now I can safely say that's not even the case. I mean, I do definitely think that this game is harder than the classic Sonic games that came before it, including reasons I'll get into later, but I think the challenge is a lot more fair than I gave it credit for. As long as you throw away the stupid mentality of, oh, it's a Sonic game, so I have to go fast and have to blaze through everything, then you can finally take the time to acknowledge the level design and platforming while still offered fast-paced gameplay. Remember, Sonic games may allow Sonic to go fast, but that doesn't mean he always has to. With great power comes... Alright, I think you guys get my point. I almost see the level design here as a hybrid between Sonic 3 and Sonic CD. They're all longer 3 to 5 minute levels with a lot of rewarding pathways that can shorten that time by 10 folds. I also love the zones here. They're all original, and despite some of them being similar to existing ones, they all feel original and organic, which is downright shocking, as that's something the series hasn't been able to get right for over a decade now. Some of my favorite zone themes here were Speed Jungle, a forest full of banding vines and grind rails ripe for maximum speedrunning. Golden Capital, a zone based solely on rings and lava, everything yellow I guess. And Egg Fortress, a normal Death Egg base on Act 1 until you reach Act 2 where you have to beat the entire level in reverse time. These are all some super cool stages. On a side note, the controls in this game are picture perfect. They feel incredibly animated and snappy, and the physics are equivalent to the Genesis classic Sonic games, which is awesome. Speaking of which, you got a good variety of characters here, whether you want to go with Sonic, Amy, Knuckles, or Tails. I personally found Knuckles to be kinda trash in this game though. I don't know. These levels are great, they just don't really complement Knuckles' playstyle very well. But Amy and Sonic are some of my personal favorites. I should definitely take this time to acknowledge this game's main selling point, the 4-player co-op, but I'm not gonna do that, because it sucks and doesn't work. Anyways, just like every Sonic game, you got your special stages, but these ones are definitely original, more on the easy side too. They have you swing Sonic around like Spider-Man to chase the Emerald. These are kind of fun, and so are the new Emerald powers. My personal favorite has to be the Fireball, as it lets you skip sections of a level or even recover from failed jumps. I also like this water power, which makes you resistant to being crushed. That's pretty cool. Even with that said though, these emerald powers aren't really a good selling point or anything. They're not like a staple. They definitely help this game stick out, but most of the time you'll forget you even have them, as it's not normal to stop every 2 minutes to use one of them. But they do make replaying stages more fun, I guess. They definitely open the window for more opportunities. And you're definitely gonna need them for the bosses, which just so happen to be the worst part of this entire game. Remember those horrible 5-minute long boss fights from Sonic Rush? Well, I guess the developers did, because they decided to just bring them back. A lot of these bosses are just big waiting games, just waiting forever for an opportunity to attack. The only issue with this is that these bosses require like 8 hits to take out. Not all of them are bad, there's some pretty fun ones, and I'm sure you can make the argument that, oh, these bosses only feel like shit to get through because Sonic players are too spoiled by the classic games having stupid easy 10-second long boss fights. And honestly, that's a fair point. I will admit that some of these bosses do feel more like real boss fights than a lot of the, say, Sonic 2 or Mania bosses. But notice how I only said some, because the majority of these bosses are not fights, but rather chores, that unfortunately drag like 3 or 2 minute zones into 5 or 6 minutes. I mean, have you seen Golden Capital Act 2? That boss is longer than the stage itself, which is inexcusable. That's insane. But hey, none of this compares to the final boss, which may just be one of the worst boss fights I've ever seen in my life. You spend 3 to 5 minutes deflecting rockets while avoiding bare-bone pace-halting attacks, only to be met with a whole second phase where you're given very little room for messing up, as the floor under you is breaking as you get chased down. It's like that really annoying final boss from Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but like on steroids. And God forbid if you die, which you're probably gonna, as this is very trial and error, you have to restart the whole fight over again. I'm not even the biggest hater of these boss fights anymore. A lot of them aren't even that bad, but even I can recognize the fact that this boss is utter dog shit. And after beating one of the worst boss fights ever made, you unlock Trip Story, which is honestly pretty shit. It's literally just the same game all over again, but not fun, as these stages are just made to be harder, with air quotes. Heavy air quotes, as all they do is fill the stage with more spikes and bottomless pits. God, that sounds so familiar. But I will say that Trip is a pretty cool character. She definitely has a more unique moveset than the rest of the characters, as she can like stick to walls, double jump and shit, and even turn into a dragon. That's super cool. Unfortunately though, her final boss fight is pretty much just as bad, although different from the first final boss. This time, instead of Eggman, it's a giant robot Fang who has some one-shot attacks, which, you know, those are never fun. But after beating him, you get to the true final boss, who is a giant dragon. Oh, and also the worst Sonic boss of all time. I don't want to waste too much time talking about these boss fights any longer, so all I'm gonna say is that this final boss is just a vague, cryptic, and unforgiving 10-minute power struggle. There's no better feeling than beating it. It's truly the worst Sonic boss I think I've ever played, and it does not deserve any more of my time. With all that out of the way, this leaves for a very tilting and strange conclusion for Sonic Superstars. On one hand, this is a pretty good-looking Sonic game, with extremely well-made and designed 2D stages that make for some of the most fun time attack runs ever, and it has a great roster of characters with cool playstyles and even emerald powers that give you incentive to replay levels and try more routes that you may have not been quick enough to nab. I mean, at that point, you'd think this would be 2D Sonic at its finest. It may be a little harder than the Genesis games, but overall, it's an original-looking, fun, fresh, new Sonic game that kind of expands the 2D formula in a way with these cool new additions. But unfortunately, it's just out of that reach. And I can't believe I went this long without even bringing up the soundtrack, which is honestly just disappointing. I mean, hey, don't get me wrong, this game has some very good tracks. Lagoon City Act 2 reminds me of that Rusty Ruin track from the Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast. That's like my favorite Sonic track ever, so that's awesome. And there's many other great tracks this game has, but it's hard to give it too much praise when it's somehow home to whatever this is. At this point, I think you get the drill. Great levels, great characters, even greater powers, yet at the same time it's held back by inconsistent polish, some of the worst boss fights you've ever seen, and a downright disappointing soundtrack, which is admittedly a big blunder. With all that being said, Sonic Superstars, 1 year later, is not a bad game. Not even a mediocre or okay game. It's genuinely a good, solid Sonic game. In some cases, I could see this being a great game. In some cases, this is one of my favorite classic Sonic games ever. I mean, you could just play all the stages on time attack mode and put a blindfold past all of its glaring issues, aside from the soundtrack, but unfortunately, seeing the game as a whole, we can't really do that, as overall, with everything considered, it's just solid. It's a great game waiting to happen, but it's chained down by some of the most pointless and avoidable issues known to man. Had they just played it safe with their bosses, not made Trip's campaign a straight-up dimps game, kept only T-Lopes for the soundtrack, and maybe not priced this game for $60, then this would have been regarded as one of the best Sonic games ever. Sonic Superstars is wildly inconsistent, but it's also super fun and even memorable. It's a great experience in some ways. It definitely belongs with the good classic Sonic games, as that's what it is. A pretty damn good game. And you know what? Even if the game isn't as great as it definitely should be, I'm glad I could see it in a more refined light, even only just 1 year later. Oh yeah, did I mention the multiplayer mode? I'm not paying $100 for this shit.